For all of the Age of Aquarius, Woodstock generation, return to the gardenisms of the hippie movement we so readily associate with the late 60s, that particular bright silver cloud always, from day dot, had an almost jet black, nihilistic lining or undercurrent to it. We might lay the blame for the death of the hippie at the feet of the Manson family cult, or the Hells Angels for the disaster of Altamont, but I think that's very easy in retrospect, and is especially convenient for those unwilling to consider that the seeds of the movement's very destruction were of course present from the very beginning. First and foremost, while the combined greed and hubris of the Rolling Stones were the ultimate driving factor behind the events at Altamont, they themselves didn't invent greed or hubris. In fact, any cultural movement attached to the entertainment industry is inevitably, naturally, and almost instantly going to be co-opted, commodified and corrupted. Such is the nature of capitalism, which is why almost everyone actually present for 1967's Summer of Love knew that it was over almost as soon as it began. You could say the same for punk, grunge, and even disco as cultural phenomenons that were similarly killed off by their very own success. But none of that is unique or unexpected, of course. At the risk of sounding prudish or puritanical, it's also surely a significant factor that the 60s counterculture centered drug use and abuse so significantly within its aesthetic. As early as August of 1967, George Harrison had already observed during his fleeting Haight-Ashbury visit that the scene had already become like flypaper for dropouts and bums, with psychedelic drugs leaving a trail of casualties in their wake no different from alcoholism or any other common addiction you could name. It is interesting, however, that drugs, psychedelic or otherwise, were so intimately tied to the hippie movement in a way that you couldn't say for punk, disco or grunge. That's probably why only the rise of house music in the UK in the late 80s is really analogous in this way, even if that dream didn't go sour itself exactly as a result. Not that psychedelia, a common element in almost all of my favourite music, can only be appreciated or understood through the use of mind-altering substances, as much as they might help, of course, but instead that to me, any art form that even nominally, suggestively, or superficially invokes the concept of mind expansion is in and of itself immensely appealing. There is something about psychedelic music that makes it perennially cool, in that the mere inference of altered consciousness is in itself subversive and transgressive, a rejection of a fusty and authoritarian mainstream society. Queerness, in one form or another, is these days rightly celebrated culturally in a similar way for the most part, pushing back against the fuddy-duddy conventions of the straight world, and the straight world. And so for that reason, the rebellious teenager, the I don't want to go to bed indignant child within me, has always been drawn to alternative culture one way or another, and after I burned through the classics of psych rock as a stoner teenager, and eventually on hearing the Nuggets box set for the first time, finally settling on psychedelic garage rock as my single favourite genre of music, I naturally sought to dig deeper into psych during what was then still the pre-internet age, at least as we now think of it. From memory, I think I first came across Forever Changes at this time because of a Mojo magazine special edition about psychedelia. Remember magazines? Mojo is indeed a bit boomer baity, but to be fair, the noughties version of me loved having a big crate of old Mojos that I could sift through and learn about music I hadn't heard before. At the time, I was living in something of a cultural wasteland. Not to say Australia is one, although in many ways it is. I mean, at the time, while the internet existed, I had very little access to it, mostly because I was a piss-poor student, and it was a choice between having internet or eating at the time. Of that choice, students today would probably choose the internet over eating, I should add, and they'd be right to do so. But back then, Mojo magazine had some kind of top 20 psych albums of all time, and while I already knew the basics of the genre, like, say, the debut album from the 13th Floor Elevators, The Small Faces, Ogden's Nut Gone Flake, and the Pretty Things SF Sorrow, to see Forever Changes by Love come in at number 1 was a mystery to me because at the time I'd never really heard anyone talk about it. I had heard of Love by then, of course, but to my mind they were just like any other garage-era group that made a handful of worthy singles and not a whole lot else. Again, this being before you could just illegally download absolutely everything, I first picked up a copy of Forever Changes while flicking through the racks of a CD shop. Remember CDs? Remember shops? Full disclosure, on first listen, I thought it was samey and boring, having been weaned on the Technicolor psych dynamism of the Beatles and Hendrix and the harder edge of garage rock. I hadn't at the time yet learned that authentic psychedelia was to be found in the subtler, folkier and folksier loose music of groups like the Grateful Dead, Country Joe and the Fish and Jefferson Airplane. Artists I to varying degrees appreciate, sure, but I've never really been in love with. Like with anything good, I was rewarded by Forever Changes on repeated listens, rinsing it relentlessly in the knowledge that it just had to be so highly regarded by the likes of Robert Plant and Julian Cope for good reason. Eventually it did click, and since then I have been annoyingly evangelical about it, not necessarily because I find its 43 minutes enjoyable in the conventional sense necessarily, but instead because this album absolutely haunts me. Why? Well, for starters, it is simultaneously easy music to listen to in that it literally shares so much in common with easy listening music, and yet at the same time it is extremely weird and unsettling. On one hand, it's full of soft instrumental tones and major seventh chords, all acoustic guitars and gentle swelling orchestrations. On the other, weird voices or perspectives appear from nowhere, its childlike melodies go in unexpected directions, and its superficially simplistic lyrics seem to peer directly into the soul. And speaking to the lyrics, it's more or less impossible to glean what any of these songs literally mean through the album's text, of course, that is to say through examining the words in isolation, divorced from the music. And while you could argue that the music does so much to impart meaning, perhaps more so than the lyrics, it's really a combination. The juxtaposition of its light and dark moods and themes, the contrast of its light and intimate instrumentation with Arthur Lee's mannered and detached vocals, and the duality of his lyrics. Even when Arthur Lee is using the contemporary, paint-by-numbers verbiage of pop music, a phrase like, "You don't know how much I love you," in this context feels like a threat. This is why Forever Changes has been described as a fist in a velvet glove, and that an appropriate name for love really might have been hate. And once the idea that everything you're hearing is actually suggestive of something else entirely, it dawns on the listener how subversive, prophetic, and terrifying this record truly is. True end-of-the-world stuff. And unlike the majority of artists who might dip their toes in a bit of fashionable doomerism from time to time, Arthur Lee doesn't do it with tales of fire and brimstone, pestilence and plague. He does it instead with little more than a wink. Even Forever Changes just about has to be the best title for an album ever, whether you know its origins or not. One reading of it suggests that changes, of one type or another, go on forever. Not unreasonable and psychedelic enough in its own way. Then to flip that, you take the concept of forever, itself an absolute, this certainty of endlessness, like an infinite universe, itself can also change, can be twisted. The idea that infinity can somehow end. This interpretation certainly plays into the existential themes of the record, the duality of meaning in its lyrics, and its oxymoronic combination of light acoustic music with a dark and foreboding dread. None of these readings are invalidated in any way by the story that the album's title supposedly came from a breakup Arthur had gone through, where in response to her saying, "You said you would love me forever," Arthur, in the spur of the moment, said, "Oh yeah, well, forever changes." And we're all familiar with that rhetorical sleight of hand. The idea that sure, maybe something I swore to, I meant at the time, even 5 minutes ago. Well, the circumstances changed. And not to make me a liar, but miraculously makes me somehow in the right. We're all guilty of reimagining the world instantaneously in a way that excuses our actions, and in identifying that behaviour, Arthur Lee signalling his own cunning, self-serving and bratty genius. Very much at odds with the then prevailing cultural headwinds, or at least, so it would seem. Because despite its smooth and delicate veneer, Forever Changes is ultimately angry, unpleasant music from an angry, unpleasant man or men. And one could be forgiven for thinking that the apparent greatest psychedelic album of all time, The Summer of Love's high watermark, the artistic embodiment of the hippie dream, should perhaps espouse the utopian ideals of peace, love and understanding. To the contrary, what we're given here is violence, paranoia and confusion. So what gives? San Francisco makes sense as the epicenter of the hippie movement, as a bohemian enclave, or at least it did back then. But I have talked about the city of Los Angeles and some of its contradicting themes in my episodes about the Monkees and Joni Mitchell. Having never been there myself physically, like for most people, my understanding of it is one formed through its presentations in the media, and I'm fascinated by what I understand to be its projected image through the dream factory of Hollywood, in contrast to its gritty reality, particularly as portrayed through music, whether it be rap and hip-hop, alternative rock, punk and heavy metal, or indeed psychedelic music. All of them have something to say about LA. And throughout the late 60s, while I'm reasonably confident that San Francisco was producing more authentic music in this vein, as the global music industry centre, LA was always going to dominate the zeitgeist in this way. And just as Hollywood has always successfully masked its seedy underbelly with an artificial glitz, glamour and razzle-dazzle, it seems perfectly fitting to me that its various simultaneously exploding music scenes of the era, from the squeaky clean pop perfection of the Beach Boys and Phil Spector, the hipster high art of the Doors and the Byrds, and eventually the coked out excess of CSNY and the Eagles, belied a very real and oppressive darkness that borders on the supernatural. And again, it wasn't just the Manson murders. It's the desperation of wide-eyed, flyover state flower children flocking to the West Coast in droves in search of fame, meaning, or oblivion, and with them, the swindlers, pimps and pushers lining up to exploit them. Any cultural movement that involves a degree of naivety, sexual freedom, and a whole lot of drugs is going to also invite the most sinister forces that humanity has to offer. Because, of course, the City of Dreams is by equal measure also the City of Nightmares. So for every musical celebration of the fine city of Los Angeles, from Randy Newman's I Love LA, The Doors, LA Woman, to the Red Hot Chili Peppers' entire discography, there's also a Bill Hicks-inspired Burn Hollywood Burn style condemnation of the place as a symbol for everything wicked and exploitative about the American dream and the consumer culture around it. But I should imagine even a bog-standard, paint-by-numbers hippie can see that for what it is. Instead, what I believe to have facilitated, if not directly driven, the kind of darkness that swallowed up the hippie dream was at least partly psychedelia's connections to occultism, and with it a preoccupation with Western esotericism, Gnostic, ancient traditions and secret societies. All things with deep roots in Hollywood and the city of Los Angeles as a dark energy epicenter. And personally, I don't know or care about any of this stuff for the most part. But whether or not there is any real material basis for these things or not, the instinct or phenomenon of paranoia in the human mind is very, very real and something easily triggered by the use of consciousness-altering drugs, the actions of clandestine organizations, and government conspiracies, both real and imagined. Because if you're Arthur Lee in 1967 and you're eating acid for breakfast, you're an ostentatious black man making waves in a white-dominated entertainment business, you turn your TV on each day to watch Vietnamese children get blown to pieces, apparently in your name, your bandmates are all strung out, your chick has split, and the pigs are threatening to bust the door down and take away all your good fun. You have pretty good reason, therefore, to want to retreat to the comfort of the hills and your pigeons. And it's interesting that Arthur Lee has stated definitively, many times, that he genuinely believed that his own death was imminent while writing and recording this album, which explains a lot about the subject matter of the songs and the overall atmosphere of the recording, for sure. Tellingly, as far as I know, he never actually specified how he thought he was going to die in his early to mid-20s around this time. Drugs were a possibility, of course. Love roadie Neil Rappaport died of a heroin overdose, supposedly in the lead-up to Forever Changes, and while Arthur didn't partake himself, heroin use had become a habit for every other member of Love, gradually after their original drummer introduced it into their circle. So not only did the spectre of death hang around Arthur and within his band, whatever else he was putting into himself, namely LSD, cocaine and alcohol, was posing a similar, if less immediate risk to his personal health. Similarly, like most 20-something young men around this time, Lee and guitarist Johnny Eccles were terrified at the prospect of being drafted to serve in the Vietnam War, so much so that they performatively dressed and behaved strangely in an effort to dissuade their local draft board from calling them up. And I'm sure it was not also lost on them that black working class men like themselves were both statistically overrepresented among combat troops and therefore casualty rates during the war. Then on that note, you additionally have their everyday experience as black men living in America in the mid-60s, both originally being from Memphis no less. Arthur's fear of how his mixed-race band, the group also being managed by a woman at the time, I might add, would be received outside the comparative liberal enclave of Los Angeles is cited as a major reason why Love failed to tour significantly outside of the city. But even close to home, they were not necessarily safe. Arthur rescued his mother from her home during the heights of the Watts riots of 1965, near where he mostly grew up, an incident where the National Guard killed 34 people, injuring and arresting thousands more, as a response to the civil unrest caused by overzealous policing of black residents in the city. Even the seemingly innocuous flower children were not safe from government crackdown, with the Sunset Strip curfew riots of late 1966 almost overnight putting so many of the hip clubs out of business where Love had made their considerable name. So beyond Forever Changes being Arthur Lee's last will and testament or not, in terms of his own actual mortality is concerned, the record is quite clearly, to my mind, more of a frontline report from the apocalypse, an end-of-days treatise on the rapture, a doomsday document. I don't think Arthur Lee just thought he was going to die. I think he thought everyone was, and soon at that. Which personally chimes with me for a few reasons. For starters, in 1967, perhaps more so in LA than anywhere else, this kind of thing was just in the air. And frankly, it's in the air now. We've seen the gradual reversal of hard-won human rights, the gradual dismantling of our democratic institutions, the breakdown of the geopolitical international order, and of course the ever-looming threat of total annihilation. As my boomer parents would say, Mickey Beats, son, we had these fears too. We had the threat of nuclear war, we had AIDS, the ozone layer, whatever, and we got over it. We survived and we prospered in the face of all of that. And it's true, they did. And maybe we will too. Even if the evidence to support that view lessens each and every day. Throughout history, people have of course felt that they are the quote-unquote special ones who will be around for the end times, and they have been proven wrong time and time again. Arthur Lee for one. But then again, that only works if you're stupid enough to set a timeline on your prophecy, which Forever Changes does not do. Similarly, I suspect I will likely myself die at a reasonably old age, touch wood, and it's the state of the world around me by then and what we will be leaving to the next generation that I suspect is what is keeping people under 50 awake at night. This is why, or at least partly why, young people aren't having kids, let alone having sex. The experience of adult life for a millennial like myself has really just been about bearing one polycrisis after another. From the global financial crisis, to austerity, to Brexit, COVID, Trump, all that stuff. All with a backdrop of unstoppable ecological disaster slowly rumbling towards us in the form of climate change. All of the major shocks we've had over the last 30 years are all pointing in one downwards direction. And to paraphrase my favourite novel, Catch-22, if everyone is feeling one way, then you'd be a damn fool to feel any different. I will concede, however, that I am of course feeling these shocks less than I am merely witnessing them so far. Such is my position of first world middle class privilege. And yes, that does play into my own lifelong paranoid suspicion that I am an observer of the world rather than an actual participant in it somehow. Again, itself something of a luxury belief. So even if I'm anything like Arthur Lee in 1967, sitting on the hillside watching all the people die, from the safety of his Hollywood Hills mansion, as a black man from a southern working class single parent family, apparently leading a countercultural revolution intended to put the shits up the establishment, was living infinitely closer to the edge of life than I am. Which is why his apocalyptic vision, the one posited on Forever Changes, in not just the lyrics and the music, but in the delivery of the lyrics and the music, is one that chimes with just about anyone who has ever looked hard at the world around them and only seen portents of doom staring back. But then again, maybe that's easy. There are whole genres of music, a lot of it not very good, entirely dedicated only to darkness and despair. No, I think what makes Forever Changes deserving of its reputation as the greatest psychedelic album of all time is in the way it somehow manages to capture all of the world's exquisite beauty amongst all of the dread. Arthur Porter Taylor was born in Memphis, Tennessee in 1945. His father was a struggling trumpet player, Arthur later claiming to only recall meeting his father on only 3 occasions throughout his entire life. He and his mother relocated to Los Angeles around age 5, where his mother remarried and Arthur formally took the surname Lee. Introverted and withdrawn as an only child, in LA, he became close to another black kid who had also relocated to South Central LA from Memphis, future Love guitarist Johnny Echols, born in 1947. Music was an early and formative influence on both of their lives, with them forming their first instrumental group in high school, Arthur Lee and the LAGs, named after Booker T and the MGs, with Arthur playing organ in the role of Booker T. Jones. They made their first recording in a surf rock vein in 1963, then of course a burgeoning style. With Echols, the more instrumentally gifted of the two on the guitar, Arthur focused his efforts in writing and producing, and as a duo, they built up a solid reputation, turning out Phil Spector and Curtis Mayfield sound-alikes for other artists. It was in this professional session work setting that they first met a young Jimi Hendrix, then a jobbing musician whose ongoing friendship with Lee especially would have a lasting impact on Lee's life and the trajectory of Love as a band. Speaking of which, while the influence of the Beatles around this time was undeniable, unavoidable even, it was more the influence of the Rolling Stones, and closer to home, Los Angeles' own The Byrds, who had the greatest impact on Lee and Echols, and the formation of their band Love. Starting initially under the name The Grassroots, they sought to combine the Byrds' jangly rock with the harder-edged R&B of the Stones, with Arthur moving to standalone lead vocalist. I think it's interesting here that while Lee modelled himself vocally very closely on Mick Jagger, who himself was of course a white man adopting a black American style, an interesting and bizarre cultural exchange at play there. In an effort to co-opt some of the hipster scene around the Byrds, Lee and Echols chose Byrds roadie Brian McLean as second guitarist in the mould of Brian Jones, a good-looking rich white kid with local industry connections, and himself a budding songwriter. Bassist Johnny Fleckenstein and drummer Don Conker would round out Love's first lineup, making them one of the earliest mixed-race rock groups in America. Beaten to the punch by another group who released a recording under the name The Grassroots, they opted to change their name to Love, and replacing their rhythm section with Ken Forsey on bass and Albin Snoopy Pfisterer on drums. This cemented Love's classic lineup, with them becoming quite the major attraction within the music scene around LA's Sunset Strip. And you can see why, considering how their presentation offered something for everybody. First with Johnny Echols as a proto-Hendrix guitar shredder on one side, blonde pretty boy Brian McLean melting hearts in the other, and in the middle, the original black hippie, the intimidating Arthur Lee in his jewellery, his shawls and his shades. Incredible that both legends like Jimi Hendrix and Jim Morrison so looked up to him for fashion and stagecraft cues. This winning dynamic saw Love soon become the first rock band signed to the Elektra label, with their debut album, the creatively titled Love, coming out in March 1966. It's a classic garage rock record in the sense that the songs are of wavering quality, but it is nonetheless full of impudent punk energy and yearning and youthful jingle-jangle. Most notably, it contains Love's version of My Little Red Book, the song written by Burt Bacharach and Hal David for early Woody Allen slapstick comedy film What's New Pussycat, with the original version performed by British group Manfred Mann. And there's a lot to say about this song. Firstly, that in its original form, as intended by Burt Bacharach, it's built around jazz chords that might land a little strangely on the ears of rock fans. And having only heard the song during a screening of What's New Pussycat, Lee and Echols' own version of the song, built from memory, is as a result quite demented in a way that exemplifies the very best of garage rock. So to explain, you start the main melody, which in isolation is quite conventional and near identical across both versions of the song, even if Love's is a semitone higher than the original, at least initially. I just got out my little red book the minute that you said goodbye. So in the original, you have this melody over a B-flat 6 chord. but with a C in the bass, which sounds like this. I just got out my little red book the minute that you said goodbye. Which at most is odd, but expectant sounding at worst. Lee and Eccles' version, however, while you can forgive them for perhaps not knowing what a B-flat 6 with a C in the bass chord is, instead just insolently vamping a root major chord and another one, a semitone up, which has a far more unsettling effect. I just got out my little red book the minute that you said goodbye. And then while the bridging section flies off into another key altogether that doesn't correspond really at all with the original, it does, however, manage to get to the relatively accessible chorus exactly as the original does, somehow. All I did was talk about you, hear your name and I start to cry. There's just no getting over you. Oh no. Even for those last rhythmic accents there, Love just substitute completely random chords for the subtler jazz ones of the original. It's bratty and Neanderthal in its treatment. Burt Bacharach supposedly despised their mangling of his carefully composed tune. Anyway, Love's version only made 52 on the charts, but that was enough to make it Elektra Records' highest charting ever single at that point, and made Love basically gods in the eyes of Jack Holtzman, who had signed them to his label, until then only specialising in folk music. Having enjoyed their very first taste of success, the members of Love actually all moved into a dilapidated mansion nicknamed The Castle, together in the hillside Los Feliz neighbourhood, basically living out the fantasies of anyone who has ever formed a band in their 20s. Their single 7 and 7 Is, released in July 1966, is an explosive slice of what I can only describe as horror surf, with its frenetic drum part and iconic fuzz bass figure from Ken Forsey, reaching number 33 as Love's highest charting single. It also features a bluesy non sequitur coda, courtesy of Johnny Eccles, and sound effects including the apparent sound of a nuclear blast, something of a call forward to the apocalyptic themes of Forever Changes. This would have been, of course, the ideal time for Love to capitalise on their success by breaking out of LA and hitting the touring circuit. But a combination of Arthur's existing self-sabotaging mindset, Elektra Records' inexperience in the rock market, and the fact that Love were a mixed-race band managed by a white woman in 1966 meant that they instead opted to remain big fish in the small, albeit influential pond of the Sunset Strip. Ahead of recording their second long player, they expanded Love's lineup to include Jay Cantrelli on saxophone and flute, as well as bringing Michael Stewart Ware on drums and moving Snoopy Fistra to keyboards, actually his natural home considering that he never saw himself as a drummer in the first place. This signalled a wider stylistic change for Love as well, with Da Capo released in November 1966, broadening the group's palette to include psychedelic jazz and Latin music on top of their existing proto-punk aesthetic. Its first half is considered an absolute classic, including such winners as Stephanie Knows Who, the aforementioned 7 and 7 Is, McLean's Orange Skies, and She Comes in Colours, all bangers. Unfortunately, it is let down by its second side, which is a single, near 19-minute jam, which I can assure you nobody, not even the members of Love, have ever listened to more than once, as vapid and pointless as it is. I don't know what they were thinking, or smoking for that matter. Other than 7 and 7 Is, Stephanie Knows Who is probably the biggest, most influential track off of Da Capo, even though it was mooted as a single at the last minute. Based loosely on Tom Jones's What's New Pussycat, that song again written by Burt Bacharach and Hal David, Stephanie Knows Who is a bonkers, furious bit of psych in a whirling 3/4 time signature featuring Snoopy's harpsichord and Jay Cantrelli's saxophone throughout, plus a screaming vocal from Lee. I love how much of the whole band's rhythmic accents stubbornly interrupt the song's flow. And then the free jazz instrumental break in the middle is worth the price of admission alone. But sadly, the song's lyric itself contains the very seeds of Love's own destruction, at least this lineup's, with the titular Stephanie being Lee's girlfriend at the time of the song's composition and Brian McLean's by the time it was being recorded for the album. This caused a permanent rift between the band's two prominent songwriters, and even though Lee was undoubtedly the group's leader and visionary, it of course only added to the growing acrimony within Love, with Eccles and McLean sharing a mutual loathing for Snoopy, who in turn grew closer to Arthur as a result, who as leader was already attracting resentment from his bandmates. As a result, during the recording of Da Capo, Lee moved out of the castle into his own house in the Hollywood Hills, a building immortalised in the rather stupid Roger Corman film The Trip, filmed partially within Arthur's then home in 1967. To compound things further, the famous riot on Sunset Strip the same month of Da Capo's release saw the majority of Love's regular gig venues disappear overnight, forcing them to sack Snoopy and Cantrelli from the band for financial reasons. The lack of gigs in the 7 months between then and the beginning of sessions for their masterpiece third album, Forever Changes, meant that the members of Love who were not Arthur Lee were unable to become familiar with and workshop almost any of the material ahead of time. It's interesting to me that certain genres of music describe a thematic unity rather than a musical or sonic one. In my episode about the band Yes, I talked about how progressive rock can be stylistically all-encompassing and broad, while at its core, it really just comes down to, if anything, lengthy songs and structures that tend to go somewhere, in the definition of the word progressive, meaning forward-looking and evolving. And even then, I could easily come up with quintessential examples from that genre that do none of those things. Pop music is probably the greatest example, in that the genre's name literally refers to its existence and success within a given marketplace, entirely detached from any common musical characteristics. Outside the broad appeal of pop music, which again is a commercial consideration rather than an artistic one, the most commonly observed aesthetics underpinning pop are probably just simplicity, repetition, and a perceived catchiness. Catchiness, in a sense, just describing a byproduct of simplicity and repetition. And all genres of music can be, and more often than not, are catchy in their own way. Love's Forever Changes is absolutely pop by this measure, especially in that Arthur Lee is on record having described his songs as being like nursery rhymes, and that they are deliberately musically and lyrically reductive, yet quite memorable once they get under your skin with their very specific magic. And on Forever Changes particularly, these songs don't stay with you because they are bombastic, shocking, or otherwise forthright in putting themselves across. They stay with you because they are subtly weird, detached and unnerving, which is why Forever Changes deserves its apparent place as the greatest psychedelic album of all time, rather than, say, Sgt. Pepper or Are You Experienced? As good as those albums are in all their ambitious, flowery pomp. What I'm saying is, Forever Changes is psychedelic in the ways those albums are not. It hides its disturbed and transgressive nature behind what on the surface are mostly mid-paced, quite samey acoustic-based Baroque pop tunes, while altogether avoiding the skin-deep psychedelic trappings of backwards guitar, sitars, and the lyrical cod philosophy of Jim Morrison and the like. Almost everyone else was doing psychedelia of the most overt and technicolor kind around this time, yet Arthur Lee and his band of not-so-merry men came up with a statement infinitely more indelible, entirely for reasons that were prevailingly out of step with the zeitgeist. For one, forget the influence of pot and LSD. Love were by 1967 almost all using heroin casually, if not habitually, years before the drug burned a trail of destruction through the heart of the rock scene. But drugs alone are not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is how ahead of the game Love were, specifically in how Arthur Lee had, by early 1967, already had a gut full of the superficial hippie movement of free love and utopian positivity, instead seeing directly through to the counterculture's inevitable endpoint: drug-fueled burnout, sleaze, criminal violence, government authoritarianism, and the commercialization of the art itself. And while Arthur's starting position of I, and quite possibly everyone else here, is shortly going to die, hugely sets the tone of this record, Forever Changes is not prophetic in the sense that it predicts the events of tomorrow, but instead that he is delivering his own judgment on the world today as he sees it, in an Old Testament way. What we're seeing now is the quote-unquote end, not the prelude to the end. And the fact that Arthur himself went on to live for almost another 4 decades after this does not make him a false prophet necessarily, as of course he never explicitly states that his or anyone else's death is imminent on the record at all. What he does do is deliver a verdict on the world from his perspective, the apparent crushing of the hippie dream under the jackboot of an overreaching government, the undercurrent of racial tension in mid-60s America, the imperial violence being meted out in Vietnam and elsewhere, and the invisible hand of consumer capitalism, all working to convince us that everything is just fine and dandy on the surface, as long as we just keep buying things. Charles Manson is a false prophet in that his vision, in the form of helter-skelter race war to end all race wars, never materialized and was never going to. The Manson comparisons are seductive, of course, bar the fact that Manson murderer Bobby Beausoleil was himself actually a member of Love for all of 5 minutes in their early days. So much is made of Manson's connections to Dennis Wilson and the Beach Boys, but that really underplays how ubiquitous Charlie Manson and people just like Charlie Manson really were in the Los Angeles music scene at the time. Everyone then was moving in similar circles, doing the same drugs, digging the same music. And while I've never actually heard anyone bring this comparison up before, listen to the scrappy acoustic guitar demos made by Manson in 67 and 68 and tell me they don't sound just like Forever Change's era Love. Just not as good, of course. Manson was definitely, in my opinion, a Love fan. And all in all, they were at least partly on the same wavelength, mining the same seam of delicate beauty and utter nihilistic dread. And within Love, if Arthur was the one mostly serving up that darkness, the flower child optimism of Brian McLean, at least as portrayed in his music, the temperament of the man himself I cannot speak to, was up until this point the yin to Arthur Lee's yang. Brought into the band for his good looks and industry connections, McLean specialised in somewhat dainty, almost twee, medieval-flavoured acoustic folk songs, of a style perhaps more logically associated with the contemporary British folk of the Incredible String Band, and later on the likes of Pentangle and Fairport Convention. But that would play down the significance of the post-war early music revival in the United States that was a big part of the folk scene and had bled into some of the Byrds' early records as well. Even today, the popularity of Renaissance fairs and the like in the States easily eclipses the equivalent living history tourism industry here in Europe. Such is the American appetite for the medieval fantasy aesthetic. So for all the carnivals of cotton candy isms of Brian McLean's lyrics, listening to his home recordings released subsequently to Forever Changes, and indeed including demos of his actual songs from it, it's increasingly obvious to me that any number of McLean's other songs could have easily found a home on Forever Changes, if given the full strings and horns treatment, save perhaps for his lyrics. And what that suggests to me, when you consider that Arthur Lee both before and after Forever Changes clearly mined a far funkier, rougher and tougher R&B flavoured form of music, is that he is in fact deliberately aping and or adopting Brian's songwriting style with its delicate acoustic moods, major seventh chords and unexpected turns. I'd go one further and say that while Arthur's lyrics on Forever Changes are absolutely his own and part and parcel of his wider vision, his voice here, again unlike on Love records before and after this time, actually sounds like Brian's. So much so that I've myself struggled to tell the difference between them at times. This is all to say that I believe Brian McLean to be the unsung hero of Forever Changes, the progenitor of its sound and feel, not unlike how Johnny Eccles was considered by many as the band's secret weapon as a live group, on account of his guitar wizardry, something showcased sadly only sparingly on this record. And for all the turmoil within the band and the various factors pulling them apart, make no mistake, Forever Changes is a Love record first and foremost, not an Arthur Lee one, even if he nonetheless dominates it. And in some ways, that risk to the group's unity was only partly down to Arthur's ego and paranoia, the band having initially agreed to making a double album with songwriting contributions from all members. Instead, Elektra Records themselves intervened to insist on paring it down to a single album, prioritising Arthur's songs over Brian's, who eventually only got 2 of his on the record, and Johnny, who didn't get a look in at all. In protest over this new, undemocratic arrangement, McLean and bassist Ken Forsey decided they would deliberately play badly for the album's initial studio sessions to force Elektra's hand, a move that backfired when, without blinking, Arthur and producer Bruce Botnick called in Wrecking Crew players to replace the whole band entirely on a handful of tracks. And this speaks to the fact that Forever Changes is still, of course, an entirely West Coast 60s artifact, one more in keeping with the older industry practices of bi-coastal major label studio norms of hiring professionals to contribute performances, as well as tasteful orchestral arrangements for the songs. Arthur Lee, who according to some reports does not feature instrumentally whatsoever on any of these tracks, very deliberately wrote the songs with string and horn arrangements in mind, rather than just a flavour to be added later. Arranger David Angel worked a solid 3 weeks with Lee, transcribing the parts that Arthur sung to him, insisting that he only receive an orchestrator credit himself outside of his arrangements for McLean's tracks, on which he was given far more artistic license. Love having outside collaborators available to them at all naturally meant that in terms of production, unlike their garage rock contemporaries, early Hendrix or even pre-Pepper Beatles, Love on Forever Changes had much more in common with Brian Wilson's Pet Sounds in that the ideas in it are what makes it a psychedelic masterpiece, not necessarily its sound, which is in many ways broadly conventional and in line with a lot of mid-60s West Coast major label studio pop. Working in a similar setting also around this time, the Byrds attempted something similar with the Notorious Byrd Brothers, a great record, but ultimately the paucity of strong and consistent ideas for that record led to a greater reliance on production tricks, or less charitably, gimmicks such as phases and early Moog synths. Love's only real musical nod to the flower power zeitgeist on Forever Changes is the sparing deployment of Johnny Eccles's white-hot electric guitar on only a handful of tracks, tentatively invoking the screaming psychedelia of Jimi Hendrix, who was of course a friend and fan of the group. Come to think of it, it's quite remarkable that Forever Changes only actually features electric guitar at all on a handful of tracks, brought in very deliberately at specific moments to provide a hard edge to all these otherwise lush arrangements. Much like Abbey Road, an album thought of in the popular consciousness as heavily produced, you're really not often hearing more than 4 or 5 elements at any one time on Forever Changes. Beyond the support the songs get from the string and horn parts, admittedly, instrumentally, we're usually just left with drums, bass guitar, and 1 or 2 acoustic guitars, usually one of them being a 12-string. Occasionally we get a harpsichord or piano, but not much more. Forever Changes is orchestrated in a fashion far more akin to a Simon and Garfunkel record. Sgt. Pepper, this ain't. And the Wrecking Crew aside, it's funny to think that the core band we're hearing on this record sound nothing like the scrappy garage band Love really were in a live setting, as well as on records both before and after this. To go one further, the consistent characteristic of the playing across almost all of the tracks on Forever Changes is not necessarily how understated it is in terms of virtuosity, which it isn't necessarily, but more how gently everything is being played, especially the drums. As a rudimentary drummer myself, I am first to admit that I am a basher, in that what I lack in technical prowess I make up for with feel, volume and power. This is not only why I would make for a poor session drummer myself, but moreover why I can appreciate how hard it is to play with this kind of sensitivity. I've spoken before about how difficult playing slowly is, especially without the benefit of a click track or whatever. But to resist playing hard and loud when the music is exciting requires an incredible amount of restraint and is basically unheard of in our post-Bonham understanding of rock music and how we expect it to sound. Nobody could or would make a record that sounds like Forever Changes now. This goes not just for the drums but for the acoustic guitars, which, if not literally finger-picked, are barely being strummed with anything resembling force. And finally, Arthur Lee's vocals, as well as Brian McLean's I might add, with whom, as I say, he shares a remarkable, similar vocal timbre, are entirely at odds with what we should expect from this band again before this record as well as after it. Arthur's vision for the group was of course modelled on the Rolling Stones, with himself in the shouty, pouty role of Jagger. But there's not a hint of that here on Forever Changes. In fact, there's really only one moment on the entire record that I can think of where Arthur sings in a heightened, emotive way at all that you might describe as dramatic, which speaks to so much of what I think is the emotional heart of the album, if not the literal meaning of its lyrical text. The substance of this record and the essence of its psychedelia instead actually stems from the presentation of the music, specifically the style of Arthur's vocal delivery. For one, it's jarring and unsettling that this apparent Technicolor rock masterpiece has a fairly consistent artistic veneer of the cocktail lounge, but the real weirdness is less in the arrangements, less in the odd songs, even less in its lyrics than it is in Arthur's detached enunciation and phrasing that somehow suggests he is the first person in the world to ever use these usually very simple, sometimes everyday combinations of words in a way that somehow imparts a deeper meaning of its own. Much like how the chords of each of these songs are basically just open chords that a beginner, in theory, could strum along to easily, there is something about the way the vocals land that are not conventional or pleasing or satisfying in the ways that we expect to hear music and lyrics. Sometimes the lyrics rhyme, sometimes they don't. Sometimes the vocal melodies have a natural cadence that resolves, but more often than not, they don't. And probably the most overtly disorientating, unique and telling moments on Forever Changes are the ones involving crosstalk, the deliberate overlapping of two different words at the end of a lyric line. More than only being a literal expression of the duality of meaning, just like the contrasting themes and musical style for the record more broadly, they also speak to an equivocating, knowingly misleading or obfuscating of Arthur's true intentions, as well as, in the context of some very deliberate, well-produced music, the appearance of a genuine aberration, a kind of glitch in the matrix. This is also done in a more meta sense at the end of another track, where one cannot be sure if their copy of Forever Changes has a skip in it or not. But more subtly, these little oddities are to be found throughout, including the weird use of grammar, smashed together words, and overly long song titles, which among this otherwise smooth and easily listening music stick out like tiny clues, details imbued with an implied significance and implied deep meaning, whether real or imagined. Even the backing vocals, more often than not just Arthur singing again in unison rather than harmonizing with himself, rather than accompanying full phrases, more often than not just provide emphasis to certain words, fetishizing them, detaching them. All of this stuff is important to the album's psychedelia in simulating the uncertainty one feels while under the influence of mind-altering drugs. How much of what I am seeing and hearing and feeling is real, and how much have I imagined or someone has placed in my way to deceive my senses? This is a question that comes up again and again on listening to this record. To quote Ewan Fairley, we are left with the assumption that nothing can be taken at face value. Indeed, the probability is that there remains hidden a deep and private code of meaning belonging to a deeply hidden inner world. And if Forever Changes is that cryptic and deep, it begs the question, what else could it be about? This is of course a difficult subject to pass, not least because Arthur Lee over the years mostly let the music do the talking, and was himself quite an erratic, mercurial, and dare I say, paranoid individual. Of the few direct, literal references to be found in the otherwise surreal and guarded lyrics, we do get a direct lift from Peter Weiss's 1964 German play Marat Sade, which Arthur is known to have been obsessed with. It's a play within a play where the famous pervert, Marquis de Sade, stages a play in an insane asylum about the French Revolution, where the assassination of de Sade's opposite number, the Marxist idealist Jean-Paul Marat, leads to the asylum choir tearing down the play itself, followed by the whole asylum. As a commentary on the utility of revolution as a whole, the takeaway insofar as that alluded to by Arthur on Forever Changes is one that chooses de Sade's isolation and individualism over Marat's collective action, indeed that espoused by the organised, more militant element within the anti-war counterculture that Arthur had himself inadvertently become a figurehead of. And while Marat Sade is the most literal reference on the record, the themes of the play itself reveal Arthur's take on the politicisation of the hippie movement, mostly that it is futile. But I would say Andrew Holtgren's in his 33 1/3 book about Forever Changes goes further to suggest that the insane asylum analogy for Arthur's predicament speaks to an even deeper theme of imprisonment, the Gnostic idea that the material world is an artificial construction that puts layers between man and God. Now, I'm not going to pretend to know much of anything about Gnosticism as a religion or a sort of category of religions or whatever it really is. But the argument is fairly compelling when you consider that, like with the perhaps tokenistic musical nods to British folk and with it the ancient world, as we hear on Forever Changes and through a lot of 60s psychedelia, there was a big revival in interest in the occult, astrology, Eastern religion, incense, peppermints, all that shit. Therefore, the idea that Forever Changes is one big ancient religious analogy for finding God one way or another is not one that I would readily dismiss, and certainly works given Arthur's own stated existential doomer mindset and the way the sequencing of its tracks, apparently sequenced by Elektra's Jack Holtzman without input from the band, begins very pessimistically and ends very optimistically. So let's see how that theory bears out. So begins the bewitching legendary track, Alone Again Or, with its delicately picked out acoustic guitar part that is in itself suggestive of the album's cryptic, everything is not quite as it seems themes. The part seemingly unsure of its own home key between D, E minor, F sharp major, and minor, and G major, combining notes from all chords, and of course setting up the apparently not quite polka, not quite mariachi, Baroque bullfight Latin flavour of the track. Arthur was apparently concerned that the opening seconds of the song's acoustic guitar intro were too quiet. But personally, I think that the delicacy here adds enormously to the track and the album's wider eeriness, much like in the opening seconds of the Rolling Stones' similarly apocalyptic disaster anthem, Gimme Shelter. It must of course also rankled with Arthur Lee that the opening track on his masterpiece, and easily its most well-known track, was one of the only two on the record written by someone else. It's difficult to know how composer Brian McLean originally envisaged the tune, as the available demos of it that are out there were actually recorded after Love's version came out. But what is generally acknowledged is that despite Johnny Echols not featuring particularly prominently on the final version of it, he is mostly responsible for the song's flamenco flavour, originally playing Spanish guitar-influenced lines mostly where the trumpet parts ultimately ended up. David Angel, who otherwise had arrangements dictated to him for Arthur's songs, was given free rein to embellish this track further with Tijuana brass orchestration for the song as first hinted at by Eccles. Unlike Lee, McLean was not forthright nor particularly precious about the instrumental arrangements for his own songs, supposedly inspired by McLean's experience of waiting on a girlfriend of his, placing him at the centre of the song as a somewhat naive summer child that he apparently was, with lines like, "You know that I could be in love with almost everyone. I think that people are the greatest fun." Making the chorus, "And I will be alone again tonight, my dear." All the more tragic and lonely in his fragile, almost tentative vocal delivery, and how the arrangement pairs back down again, especially in contrast to the wider track being really quite energetic and forthright. But speaking to the manner in which the song is sung, again something I believe Arthur was kind of cribbing from Brian across the whole record, is the most commonly stated fun fact people have about Alone Again Or. That being that Brian McLean's main vocal performance was deemed too weak, therefore Arthur's counterpoint vocal melody was brought up in the mix subsequently to dominate the original. Personally, I don't really think that's true. Firstly, listening to McLean's demo of the track, admittedly recorded after this version, it's clear to my ears that his melody is still the dominant one in the final version, and certainly the one of the two melodies that I consider the main one. However, Arthur's part is indeed loud enough for me to consider them more or less on par volume-wise, a rare love co-lead vocal, if you will. None of this is made easier by the fact that they both have strikingly similar voices in many ways, deliberately in my opinion, as I've said. Whatever the true nature of this track was, insofar as Brian or Arthur's intentions and motivations are concerned, and Arthur's apparent addition of the word "or" to the song's title being typical of the kind of small detail he adds that makes this music so suggestive from the off, Alone Again Or perfectly sets off the uneasy listening tone of Forever Changes with its light feel and dynamic orchestration against a fairly pessimistic lyric, and the circumstances of its conception and execution make it something of an unintentional miracle in its way. It even ends on a lone guitar chord suggestive of a cryptic, lonely uncertainty. The fact that the last chord of Alone Again Or into the first chord of A House Is Not a Motel is a full tone downwards makes the introduction of A House Is Not a Motel a relieving of tension of sorts. What can only presumably be Brian McLean's 12-string guitar to start with, he is soon joined by a nimble yet delicate rhythm section in Ken Forsey and Michael Stewart Ware, demonstrating immediately that they have more than the requisite Wrecking Crew level chops required for this music. Following on from Love's iconic version of My Little Red Book, Arthur again leans into the Bacharach David aesthetic by adopting or adapting the title of their song, A House Is Not a Home. And while the choice of house against a motel here has been said to represent the dichotomy of church and state, reality and fantasy, body and soul, it could just as easily reference the transient halfway house that Love had previously occupied together as a group, or Arthur's subsequent paranoid fortress in the Hollywood Hills. Probably all of these things. Either way, the lyric is clearly him setting out his judgment of the world around him, full of psychedelic, spooky imagery. Are the shackles he mentions, or lack thereof, a reference to some kind of occult ritual? And can your senses, so real to touch, to smell, to feel, be trusted in this world? A world where the streets are paved with gold and the water turns to blood? We do know that the description of blood and mud combining to become grey came from a traumatised Vietnam vet that Arthur had met on the Sunset Strip, adding to the idea that this song is a wider Vietnam-era topical commentary. By the time that I'm through singing, the bells from the School of War will be ringing. More confusion, blood transfusions, the news today will be the movies of tomorrow. And a key line right there, the fakeness of Hollywood turning real violence and suffering into family entertainment. Also, the world tomorrow should, in theory, rhyme with the word ringing here, if going by the rhyming scheme established in the earlier verses. The more you look at the way Arthur uses rhyming, you realise that he establishes rules and then breaks them constantly, so that a new word or structure within a verse or a single phrase sticks out in a way and changes our perspective very suddenly. It's deliberately jarring. The slight sharpness of Arthur's second and final, "I hear you calling my name," only adds to the horror of the track as we're treated to the drum breakdown, followed by a face-melting twin guitar solo from Johnny Eccles, himself apparently recording the second part without being able to hear the first. A House Is Not a Motel represents the most heightened, frenetic moment on Forever Changes, and as a result is probably the most conventionally psychedelic track on this record, but certainly not in a fun or easy listening sense. It's scary. The stately ballad Andmoreagain is a track that you could have easily fooled me if you had said it was one of Brian McLean's. Then again, it's perhaps lyrically far too dark and weird, come to think of it. I mean, for one, has anyone really before this ever thought to smash words together for a compound song title in this way? With its dreamy major 7th chord introduction and the lush string accompaniment, it brings Forever Changes down after the intensity of the album's first two tracks, and to my mind is a far more significant song than what its modest presentation would suggest. While it is dressed up as a love song, it perhaps offers the album's most incisive critique of materialism, with Arthur going on record to say that Andmoreagain is supposed to be a creature, perhaps even an anthropomorphized embodiment of American consumer greed, let's say. And if you see Andmoreagain, then you might be Andmoreagain. And hey, maybe the hideous beast Andmoreagain looks, acts, and consumes no differently than you or I. For you just wish and you are here, and you feel your heart beating thrum-pum-pum-pum. The repeated thrum-pum-pum-pum heart-beating motif again and again, highlighting a conflict between our physical selves and the seductive pull of the material. Wrapped in his armour, as he says, the chorus on reflection being quite bizarre in its choice of words and notes especially. A demented nursery rhyme indeed. Even the way that he sings, "But my things are material," both in the pulling apart of real from the rest of the word, as well as the not ugly but also not pretty or predictable choice of note for that particular syllable, suggests a double or hidden meaning. And like a few other very specific moments elsewhere on Forever Changes, Arthur very briefly breaks free of the confines of the song in the bridge for "And you don't know how much I love you, oh, oh, oh," in an apparent moment of sincerity as the strings swell up behind him, if only for a moment. A bizarrely beautiful song, one where you kind of have to pinch yourself and remember this is ostensibly a mid-60s pop record. I can't imagine what producer Bruce Botnick or members of the Wrecking Crew, and yes, this is one of the 2 tracks where they played on the basic track instead of the actual Members of Love, must have made of its austere weirdness. Yet another track featuring various members of the Wrecking Crew, The Daily Planet is the closest thing we get to a mid-60s power pop track on Forever Changes. But of course that's before you realise how completely weird it is also. Rumoured to have been produced by friend of the band, Neil Young, but almost definitely wasn't, The Daily Planet was the first track recorded for Forever Changes and is suitable thematically in that it jauntily sets out Arthur's journalistic experience of the everyday as if being reported from the front line. In the morning we arise and start the day the same old way as yesterday, the day before. And The Daily Planet, the kind of newspaper the aliens read while munching their toast in order to catch up on whatever the humans are up to lately. All in all, it's just a day like all the rest, so do your best with chewing gum, and it is so repetitious, waiting on the sun. And then it starts all over again, all optimistic and sunny, with a McCartney-esque single-note pumping bass line. In fact, if the whole lyric wasn't so dripping with sarcasm, you could imagine the Beatles doing something like this in a Good Day Sunshine, Revolver era kind of way. But after 2 times through this poppy verse chorus structure, after only a minute and a half, Arthur perverts the track, and we're taken into the disturbing windmills of his mind. Starting with a downwards mood shift from A major to A minor, then into what seems like a short bridge where among all the sunshine and hustle and bustle, Arthur suddenly gets a shiver up his spine and introduces us to the Iceman. Who is the Iceman? The Ice Cream Man? Death himself doing his rounds? Or the hippie Johnny, whose dream is starting to melt, to wither under the lights? Well, we aren't given too much time to find out, as we're seemingly back to the song's intro, on top of some delightfully distorted feedback. But before we get too comfortable with that, the song makes yet another about turn into an altogether new section. I can see you with no hands. And with that, we get the first bit of crosstalk on the album, with both the word hands and face being sung at the same time. The trick repeated again with heart and face in the next line. Eyes, I need you, you're my heart. The way the disembodied voice shouts out, face, is so disorienting. I find it all very creepy considering how bright the main part of the song is. And then it changes entirely yet again before we get too used to that. Look, we're going round and round. Some seemingly overdubbed floor tom rhythm there. The whole thing is just bizarre. A demented twist on a sunny pop song. One which nonetheless returns to the optimism of the song's intro for its gradual fade out. All is not what it seems in Loveland. Old Man is Brian McLean's second of 2 songwriting contributions to Forever Changes, and on balance probably the slightest track on the album. And while it might be literally the shortest, I don't mean it in that sense. Few of the songs here break the 4-minute mark after all. Its lyric is fairly straightforward, in Brian recalling his encounter with the wise old man who has been everywhere in the world and seen most everything. The mention of the old man seeing the light and giving Brian a small brown leather book, a Bible perhaps, is interesting given Brian's own subsequent spiritual conversion following the release of this album and the breakup of the band. Its modest presentation, with its delicately picked acoustic guitar, ever-present swelling strings, is at least musically very much in keeping with the album's wider feel, and it's not without some short flashes of lifting, lilting beauty. You are so lovely, you didn't have to say a thing. Once again, on Forever Changes, an apparent moment of fragile sincerity among all the surrounding sinister darkness. Speaking of which, even without Arthur Lee apparently featuring at all on this track, it still has a couple of weird details. Namely, the jarring, deliberately out-of-tune notes on the words "good advice" and "leather book," and the song's haunting final chord. The Red Telephone is in many ways the centerpiece of Forever Changes, the album's spiritual heart, if you will, leaving out its finale, of course, of which you could probably say the same thing. That said, it starts unassumingly enough. A creepy, lone guitar, not unlike the one that introduces Alone Again Or, and the gentle way in which the band and vocal enters the first verse somewhat distracts from how weird and unsettling the underlying chord progression of the verse really is. Sitting on the hillside, watching all the people die. And of course, there we get the iconic line that basically lays out Arthur's entire perspective for the whole record, observing the hustle and bustle of Sunset Strip from on high, the toing and froing of LA's hips to set, stuck in their own repetitive Andmoreagain patterns of consumption and behaviour. After just a hint of harpsichord, the second verse directly tells us that Arthur has been psychedelicized, possibly through the use of drugs, of course, but also through the use of the word magic, possibly magic with a K, suggesting occult practices of one type or another. He tells us to look into his eyes, and now we're under the spell as well. The perspective continually shifts as he asks us what we're seeing, with the answer from another voice entirely being interrupted by his next question, and Arthur's own pronouncement that he... I feel real phony when my name is Phil. Or was that Bill? Has he forgotten his name? Has he had some kind of ego death? Who knows? Whatever's going on, it's weird. So after 3 verses, we're brought gently into a new section altogether, which builds up with a swelling string arrangement into a beautiful, cathartic moment. Not of epiphany exactly, more of a realization that Arthur is himself trapped in some kind of limbo, suspended between life and death. Don't know if I'm living, if I'm supposed to be. Sometimes my life is so eerie. A glorious call and answer from David Angel there. But more importantly, we get more crosstalk here where Arthur sings, and if you think I'm happy, paint me something. And while it's impossible to really tell what words are being said here simultaneously, you can at least make out the words white and yellow. Is Paint Me White a nod to the Rolling Stones, a nod to his ghostliness, now having decided that he is dead? Or is it racial? Similarly, is yellow a reference to the Vietnamese or some kind of symbol of cowardliness? Either way, duality is clearly what he is driving at again in the following repetition of that section, where the line is changed instead to, and if you wanna count me out, where we hear both the words in and out. Like John Lennon in Revolution the following year, Arthur is having his cake and eating it too, both being with and indifferent to the counterculture movement. Whatever side he picks, he's certainly alive to the risks involved, whether that be from dodging the draft, being a black man in America in the mid-60s, or having your head bashed in by a cop during a protest/riot. As he repetitively, soberly, and most tunelessly intones, "They're locking them up today, they're throwing away the key. I wonder who it will be tomorrow, you or me," in the song's outro. Creepy. And then the final, "We're all normal and we want our freedom" line, and its somewhat playful iterations at the song's close, is a direct quote from the Peter Weiss 1964 play Marat Sade, a work that we know Arthur was obsessed with and is key to understanding the wider existential thrust of Forever Changes, with the red telephone at its thematic core. The first but not last song on this record, with a deliberately verbose title, Maybe the People Would Be the Times or Between Clark and Hilldale, kicks off side 2 energetically, invoking the rhythm of track 2, A House Is Not a Motel. In fact, the drum part especially on this is incredibly tight, fast and controlled. You could be forgiven for thinking the big swinging dicks of the Wrecking Crew are all over this one. Certainly, the musicianship is on show across the board, including a Burt Bacharachian dual trumpet solo. You can even hear Arthur singing its melody exactly alongside. So sure he was of how these melodies were supposed to fit into his songs. Johnny Echols' acoustic guitar solo at the end is also a highlight. Lyrically, it is another report from the front line, perhaps in the latest edition of the Daily Planet. This time specifically referring to perhaps Arthur's favourite patch along Sunset Boulevard, the block between the Hilldale Avenue and Clark Street of the song's title, containing the famous Whiskey A Go-Go nightclub. While certain lines like, "Gotta go but I'll see you again," and "When I leave now, don't you weep for me, I'll be back, just save the seat for me," gives a heavy Hendrixy, "If I see you no more in this world, I'll meet you in the next one," death and rebirth kind of vibe. My favourite thing about the lyric is how the implied last word of each line, which is not typically sung or said at all, is always the first word of the next line, even if there's a 5-second or so gap between each section. He's clever, our Arthur. Live and Let Live is the one everyone remembers for its opening line about snot caking against Arthur's pants. But whatever the significance of that line really is, be it a reference to drugs or whatever, I suspect is largely irrelevant to the song's wider meaning. I interpret Live and Let Live as a somewhat libertarian, freeman of the land sort of anthem, Arthur siding with the Marquis de Sade's character in Peter Weiss's play as the freewheeling individualist, as opposed to the idealist with his faith in collectivism. He goes further to take those themes from the French Revolution into present-day America, where the asylum warden / cop / bluebird sits on his branch, watching over the inmates, who Arthur argues is on his land, just like in a previous life when he was an American Indian. I think the Native American theme is particularly significant, beyond Arthur being a black man in America, of course, but more so towards his belief in his right to freedom and to resist anyone who threatens that. Arthur would, of course, go on to spend a significant part of his life in jail after all. In fact, beyond the well-mannered verses and the chorus, if you could call it that invokes the semitone shifts of Alone Again, or "And so the story ended, you know it oh so well." The song then becomes preoccupied with the idea of imprisonment and the album's repeated theme of existing in a spiritual purgatory. Serve my time, served it well, make my soul a sound. Now, I had always wrongly heard this as, "You made my soul ascend," which makes for quite a positive reading. But the fact that he says, "You made my soul a cell," like a prison cell, supports Andrew Holtgren's theory in his book about Forever Changes, that this is a nod to the ancient Gnostic concept that our physical bodies are what are preventing us from reaching God, or something like that. In light of that, I mentioned Bill Hicks earlier for his loathing of the city of Los Angeles and all it represents, and this quote from him could well be a description of Forever Changes and what Arthur is getting at here. "Today, a young man on acid realized that all matter is merely energy condensed to a slow vibration, that we are all one consciousness experiencing itself subjectively. There is no such thing as death, life is only a dream, and we are the imagination of ourselves." Here's Tom with the weather. Or better yet, here's Johnny Echols with a ripping electric guitar solo. The good humour man, he sees everything like this, supposedly inspired by Nowadays Clancy Can't Even Sing, one of Neil Young's early contributions to the Buffalo Springfield. Hummingbirds, as this song was originally titled, had been kicking around for a little while by this point. Whether Arthur retconned the song to make it slot thematically into Forever Changes is certainly something to consider, but it sounds to me like Arthur is closely aping some of Brian McLean's Flower Child musings. To go one further, I think the tongue-in-cheek, overly long song title is about recontextualizing the idyllic imagery of the lyric to suggest that what we're hearing is perhaps the imagined outlook of the deluded everyman, the fantasist, the fool, the good humour man who never sees the bad times coming. Whatever the truth is, it's certainly a gentle and thoughtful arrangement that makes up for its sparse text, with its pizzicato strings and final moments where the master has been deliberately chopped up, perhaps to invoke a deliberately jarring, being woken up in the middle of a dream kind of feeling. Very clever and meta in how it takes us out of the song and its apparent easy listening surface level feel. The strident piano-heavy arrangement of Bummer in the Summer injects a bit of last-minute energy into proceedings as we get towards the end of Forever Changes, and is a comparatively bright and breezy bit of pop suitable for the increasingly optimistic tone that we are getting towards the end of the record. Arthur's Bob Dylan-esque rap is novel and perhaps more reminiscent of his yesteryear singing style with Love, quite animated and jivey in its way. Well, I remember when you used to look so good, then I did everything that I possibly could for you. The otherwise straightforward "I've got relationship problems" lyric is punctuated with the repeated hook, "I ain't got no papers on you," which in context of the song might suggest marriage, but in the context of the wider album hints at a slightly paranoid fear of government authoritarianism, to my ears at least. Like saying, "I haven't got a case file on you, no evidence I can use against you." He even goes so far as to say he has no papers on himself. Again, like Desaad, Arthur cannot be tied down either way by his chickie babe or by the man or anyone else. With its super simple 3-verse structure and its very Buffalo Springfield coded guitar solo, Bummer in the Summer is in and out in less than 2.5 minutes, making it the shortest cut on the album. Now, I have a lot to say about album closer You Set the Scene, as it's very personal to me and among very few tunes that I consider to be my own funeral music. And not just because it's sad, which it isn't even though it consistently makes me weep, or epic, which it is, although not conventionally perhaps, but instead because in a fairly non-specific, impressionistic way, it somehow sums up all of the beauty and weirdness of life in this world as I happen to see it. In a sense, even its title is Arthur decisively settling the question posed by Murat Saad, suggesting that like in a fictional play within a play, you set the scene to your liking, just as you live your life as you choose to, not at the whims of others or any political or cultural movement. And while my personal politics are indeed rooted in collectivism, as a low-key, instinctive contrarian, I also can't help but be drawn to You Set the Scene as an individualist anthem, a beacon or guiding light that warns us against getting swept along with the crowd. In later years, Arthur would introduce this song as a future classic, and he was right to. It's interesting to me that it seems very deliberately placed at the end of the record as a big, profound ending of sorts, which let's not forget in 1967 was a relatively new idea, Sgt. Pepper having only just come out with A Day in the Life, playing a similar role on that record. And while You Set the Scene is made up of two very distinct halves, in contrast to so many of this album's tracks that are not so gentle and diatonic, at least in terms of the chords being used, the picked acoustic guitar chord that opens the first half of the track itself sounds like a question being asked. I mean, it's weird enough as it is, but when the pumping bass enters, you realise that despite there being an A in the lowest note of the guitar chord, the chord itself in this part of the song is actually in B, which when taken together is quite dissonant. The nimble drum part enters and we get Arthur's first of two verses, both starting off light by invoking themes of reincarnation and the meaning of personal autonomy in this life. Where are you walking? I've seen you walking. Have you been there before? And a lovely line from what sounds like a cello. Walk down your doorsteps, you take some more steps. What did you take them for? So far, so good. In the following section, which similarly repeats after the second verse, Arthur lays out examples of people failing to meet societal expectations. Firstly, the private in Arthur's boat with pins instead of medals, the demands of the chicken, or woman, in his nest/bed, and the disapproving father, all characters setting bars for you to hurdle, not because any of this really matters, but instead as a means of control. But we are no different from anyone else in this way. We are all transactional in this life. You might be on fire, but until you can bring yourself to ask for water, you're destined to sit there and burn, as he says. At least that's what the first half of the song seems to be saying. We seemingly return to the beginning with the lone guitar once again, with the full band coming back in under the strings with their strident and tuneful melody. From there, the first half of the song seemingly ends with a drum fill, after which we completely change gear for the second, more centered half. The trumpets first preempt Arthur's subsequent vocal melody, while the strings establish the first slide-up accents that recur throughout the rest of the piece. This is the time in life that I am living, and I'll face each day with a smile. What this says to me is that despite all of the paranoid despair, the foreboding uneasiness to be found within all the tracks on Forever Changes, Arthur has emerged at the end of this, reborn and with a new sense of optimism, having seen as far as one can see, having marched through hell for a heavenly cause, proactively choosing to move forward with positivity and purpose towards the light and away from the darkness. This is the only thing that I am sure of, and that's all that lives is gonna die. The lines in this part of the song are the ones that most resonate with me personally. Arthur is making peace with his apparent, imminent death, and is in fact smiling at the thought of his own mortality. And there'll always be some people here to wonder why, and for every happy hello, there will be goodbye. There'll be time for you to put yourself on. Safe in the knowledge that wherever he is, someone like him, someone like you or me perhaps, is always here on this mortal coil to ask the big questions, and that there is truly nothing for us to fear. The verse that begins with, "Everything I've seen needs rearranging," is the most direct reference to the setting, the scene, as referred to in the track's title, going on to suggest that we're all playing a part in this game of life, and while the world might be a stage in a Peter Weiss play, it is still up to us what part we choose to play. And if you don't like that, well, that's on you. From here begins a series of bridging sections that to my mind are all about edging the listener towards the song's big ending, building us up several times before pulling back again. The first two are the same with this very satisfying chord progression. I see your picture, still in the same old frame. We meet again. Before it pulls back again to the F major and the C major, and another similar section. I can't help but chuckle at the thought of Arthur Lee trying to explain the purpose of all these constituent parts of the song to someone like Bruce Botnick or David Angel in the studio. Although it must be said that Angel's exotic Eastern-flavoured orchestral flourishes are absolutely gorgeous here. And in fact, for a moment they also disappear, and the arrangement briefly strips down to the strut of the bass and drums for one of the album's sexier, bluesier moments when Arthur sings, "I need you so." Again, a very rare flash of sincere, heartfelt yearning that we get across the album. We're edged one last time before the arrangement gears up for the outro, starting with a repeat of the "This is the time in life that I am living" verse, and finally the song's outro proper. This is the time and this is the time and it is time. And with that, the last words heard on Forever Changes before the triumphant trumpets march us off into the sunset is Arthur intoning his final and most essential command. Now is the time to live your life, because even if you live 1,000 lives after this one, you can just cross that bridge when you come to it. The iconic cover art for Forever Changes, courtesy of Elektra Records in-house designer Bob Pepper, depicts a kind of advance on the Beatles' Revolver cover illustration in a sense. In this case, combining the band members' faces together in the shape of a heart, and or also, in the minds of some, the continent of Africa. Tellingly, label art director Bill Harvey added a smile to Arthur's face after the fact, which makes it either more or less menacing depending on your point of view. It was released in November 1967 to a muted reception stateside, reaching a paltry 154 on the US album chart, Love's lowest showing for an album release up until that point. Much like Brian Wilson's masterpiece of the previous year, Pet Sounds, Forever Changes had far greater impact in the UK on release, where it reached number 24. Also, like the Beach Boys, Love themselves turned down an offer to play the Monterey Pop Festival during the sessions for Forever Changes, which is to my mind one of the great what-ifs of pop history. Instead, what did happen is that after recording 2 more tracks with this current lineup, the band kind of organically fell apart without formally splitting up. It is said that they basically just stopped talking to each other, and with the weight of everybody's heroin habits, as well as Brian McLean's impending solo album deal with Elektra, only furthering the animosity between himself and Arthur, and all of this on top of the failure of Forever Changes, it's really no wonder. Arthur Lee then simply put together another lineup of Love without informing any of the others, consisting of a shifting lineup of young bucks who were more interested in the noodly blues rock then taking hold in the UK than they were in preserving Love's more psychedelic pop vibe. People tend to be quite down on the subsequent lineups of Love, but I think they are consistently excellent and interesting players if you can look beyond things like endless drum solos and general overplaying, which I don't really have too much of a problem with. And while of course Arthur didn't go on to die young as he predicted, his songwriting mojo mostly seemed to die something of a death after Forever Changes, as much as I actually really enjoy Love's subsequent records. 1969's For Sale is probably the best of the bunch, a record I think is really good if you can allow yourself to forget that this is in theory the same band that gave us the greatest psychedelic album ever made. I love every cut on it, except probably Robert Montgomery and Talking in My Sleep. Neither of them are bad, of course, but Arthur never lost his talent for sticking his nursery rhymes in your head, and those are just 2 of the tracks on this record that I haven't quite enjoyed having stuck in mine at 3 in the morning. Always See Your Face is probably Love's late period nugget that pops up again and again in hipster films after having been forgotten about for decades. It's a great tune. The double album, Out Here, was released at the turn of the decade and makes for an interesting hodgepodge of tracks, although you do have to wade through a lot of filler to pick out the gold, as it were. Love Is More Than Words, or Better Late Than Never, is probably my favourite cut on this one. Just before his death, Jimi Hendrix guested on the opening track of 1970's False Start, not a record I'm inclined to spend a lot of time with, honestly, and the same is true of 1974's Reel to Reel, the last album released during Love's original run, with Arthur bringing in session players after sacking everyone else from the latter-day version of the band. Arthur also released an underwhelming solo album, Vindicator, in 1972. He got stuck into cocaine pretty majorly throughout the 70s as Love's commercial fortunes gradually dwindled. As for Love's other original members, at least those who appeared on Forever Changes, Brian McLean left the music industry and kicked the drugs, eventually becoming a born-again Christian artist, before passing away in 1998. Michael Stewart Ware continued as a session musician, Ken Forsey succumbed to substance abuse and died in 1998, and Johnny Eccles got clean and became a music teacher and is now leading a version of Love Today. Arthur Lee's poor fortunes finally started to turn around in the 1990s when the American alternative rock band Mazzy Star covered an obscure track from one of his Wilderness Years releases, kickstarting a renewed interest in this famously self-sabotaging and reclusive 60s rock casualty. He hooked up with Los Angeles-based power pop band Baby Lemonade, who he considered the new Love, while they separately also maintained their own career as a standalone band. Unfortunately, California's 3 strikes law saw Arthur Lee imprisoned for 5.5 years for discharging a firearm in the air on quite possibly bogus charges. While he patched up his relationship with Brian McLean from prison, McLean and Forsey both died while Lee was incarcerated, more or less killing off any chance of an original Love reunion. A changed man on his release, He reunited with Baby Lemonade to tour the world for the next 5 years, doing mostly Forever Change's material, which had by then garnered almost mythical acclaim, especially in the UK and Europe. With Baby Lemonade, he performed the Royal Festival Hall in London and the main stage at Glastonbury with full string and horn accompaniment. Johnny Eccles also eventually joined Lee in what was, as close to humanly possible, a love reunion. Sadly, Lee was diagnosed with leukemia sometime around 2004, something not revealed to his bandmates at the time. He was also a diabetic and suffering from Parkinson's disease from as far back as his incarceration. A series of tribute concerts were arranged to help raise funds for Lee's treatment in early to mid-2006, but a stem cell transplant did not take, and Arthur Lee died in August 2006 at the age of 61. So there you have it. Arthur Lee lived several decades beyond what he believed at the time to be his last will and testament. I would argue, however, that this detracts in no way from Forever Changes, as it is so fully realised in its ideas and flawless in terms of execution, and it really says something that Arthur Lee's career before and after Forever Changes paled enormously in comparison. How could it not? But that doesn't really matter. Either way, Arthur was sincere in his critique of the world around him on this record. He had good reason to be paranoid, and that paranoia manifested itself in an apocalyptic vision, whether literal or figurative. Because Forever Changes signalled not the big bang of the psychedelic music scene after all, but instead represented the full stop at the end of it, before anyone else saw it coming. And considering the proven relationship between psychedelic drug abuse and the onset of paranoia, and in extreme cases psychosis, it seems appropriate also that it thematically deals not so much with the winding up of an ultimately frivolous social and cultural trend, but rather the end of the world itself. And maybe the reason it did so poorly on release is that at the very height of flower power, hippie utopia, nobody really wanted to be confronted with this kind of thematic heaviness, the kind of heavy realness that makes this album resonate with anyone across the subsequent decades who has ever wondered why, and has perhaps accepted that all that lives is going to die. And looking at the state of the world now, one feels obligated to consider that maybe after all these years, Arthur was right after all. With 2020's eyes, something like Forever Changes feels like a mistake, an aberration, an example of a time when the lunatics took control of the asylum. And I'll put money on the idea that we'll be talking about it decades after everyone who was alive to hear it when it first came out is no longer with us. In my high school music class, we closely studied both Pet Sounds and Sgt. Pepper's as pinnacle examples of popular music as proper works of art. Both releases from then mainstream artists at the top of their game within a 2-year period between 1966 and 1967, at a time in the culture when anything seemed possible. In an alternate, fairer universe, Forever Changes would instead absolutely be the album of choice for close study, both because it is obviously a singular work of musical genius, but also because of the story it tells us about how a seemingly optimistic movement was subsumed by the personal and political forces of darkness. Neither Pet Sounds or Sgt. Pepper have subtext like that. In fact, I don't think they really have subtext at all. Excellent music is, in a sense, easy. But imbuing every note and every word with both literal and subtly and suggestively implied deep meaning is really next level, and few records offer anywhere near as much as Forever Changes does in this way. So what does Arthur Lee and his final will and testament teach us? Well, let me put it this way. Very recently, while in the process of writing this, a work colleague of mine became drunkenly upset with me, in a totally harmless way only good friends can, at the idea that I myself had no fear of death. In our conversation, she became almost hysterical at the idea that I don't covet my own existence more keenly than I do anyone else's, or the misconception that I do not value my life in a way that makes me fearful of losing it. I am fearful of losing it, don't get me wrong. I do of course value my life immensely, and I am an extremely happy and grateful person for the most part. I have a wife, a dog, a job that doesn't suck too much, a house, not a motel, I might add, and I have the luxury of filling my spare time with as much music and politics and comedy and beer as I possibly can, at least for now. But the reason that I harbour no fear of death is precisely because of the lessons I have taken from art, and Forever Changes is right up there insofar as how much wisdom I've been able to wring out of it, again and again. Most of the records I love, the ones I have covered on this channel, are great. But through close study, I usually have to give myself a cooling off period afterwards, just to give myself the mental space I need to fall in love with them again. Not so with this one. After recording this, I'm going to step outside and listen to Forever Changes while walking my dog. I will never stop wanting to hear this record. It will never, ever, ever get old. Why? Because more than just being great music, which it is of course, it shows me, in fact it proves to me, without a shadow of a doubt, time and time again, that life is for living. Everything is going to die, yes, but that certainty is counterintuitively freeing. The universe doesn't give a shit about what I do with my life. That is entirely up to me, and seeking validation in any way is nothing more than pure vanity, the realization of which in turn allows me to be truly free. I'm not scared of anything now, not even terminal illness, and I will feel that way forever because I choose to. Forever. And just like any other human, the second I'm faced with death, I will probably hypocritically change my tune because I am ultimately a pathetic mortal who talks the talk but only maybe walks the walk. Forever. Why? Well, because the thing about forever is that sometimes it fucking changes. Deal with it.